Hello everyone, and welcome to this fifth lesson in sculpting the head using Dynamesh in ZBrush. And we're just going to continue from where we left off last time. Um, Now, I did make available the reference images that I was using on the image planes, so I will put the link in the description. And if it doesn't work, just let me know in the comments, and I'll try to fix it. But hopefully it does work. All right, so that's what I'm using on my other monitor right now to just create the sculpt. As I'm looking at the reference images that I had on the image planes in the previous lessons. Now, most likely I won't copy exactly. If it's a little different, that's fine too. But that's just kind of a general. I'm just going to use the reference images as a general guideline to follow for this tutorial. So I've already selected my model from Lightbox, and I'm just going to drag it on the canvas. Now, if you remember, at this point it's not editable, so if you keep on drawing, it's just going to draw it out multiple times. So let me just Control N to clear that, and let's drag it on, and remember to press T to go into edit mode. Okay, so it automatically goes into draw. Now I'm going to change my background. I'm going to take off the gradient. So I went to Document, take off the range. I'm going to click, drag, and just click this gray area here. And now I'm just going to go to the matte cap gray. Now you can use any material that you want. I like this material. It's pretty simple, and for what we're doing, I think it's great. I'm also going to go into the render, preview shadows, and take off deep shadows. Okay, so this is where we left off on the last video, and just to double check, I'm going to go into geometry and let's look at the Dynamesh. So we're still in Dynamesh, okay, and at the resolution at 240. Now your resolution is going to vary because it depends how big your model is on the canvas. In the scene. But if you started from a sphere, most likely it'll be around the same size as the model I created. So it'll probably be close. In any case, if you look at the active points, we're around 360,000 active points, and that's kind of where you want to be with your resolution. So however you want to change, however your resolution is on here doesn't matter as much as it does up here. Okay, so you might be able to get that resolution if you go to 128, for instance. It depends how big your model is in the scene. And to figure that out, let's see. If you press Shift P, this kind of gives you an indication of how big your model is in relation to the grid. So if this was, let's just go into deformation here. So if this model was really big, you'd see it'd look like this. So it's always in relation, like the grid can give you kind of an idea of how big your model is. And if you want to make that model the right size or a good size for the scene, just press Unify, and that'll unify the model. Now, if you have any subtools, it won't unify those, but you can always, let's see. No, it won't do it. Okay. So anyway, I just Control Z and undid all those changes. But that's just Dynamesh works on the scale of the object. So if the bigger the scale, the less resolution you need in the resolution slider. So generally, if you have a smaller object, and I don't mean smaller in this sense, like this is actually not changing any object size. It's just zooming in and out. I mean in relation to this grid. Okay, so this is a pretty good size actually. If this was a lot bigger, I wouldn't need as much resolution on the slider. But I find that this size here is pretty flexible because I can go lower or higher. It gives me more range anyway. And this is kind of the default size that the sphere started off at, so it works pretty well. But anyway, the point was that you have to look at the points to try to kind of mimic where I'm at with this. Okay, so that was a little bit of a tangent. I apologize for that, but let's continue on. Okay, so I'm in perspective mode, and if you remember, I can just press P to go into orthographic or perspective. Let's see where we're at here with my perspective. We're at 50. I'm just going to keep it there. I could go a little lower if I wanted to. Maybe, let's say, 35 or something. That looks probably better. Now that value I gave it doesn't correspond to like a 35mm lens or anything like that. It's just it doesn't correspond to anything except ZBrush, so it's just kind of a number I have in mind that works well, I find, for heads at this scale. It does change according to the scale as well. Okay, so now looking at, I have my reference image on my other monitor, and it's the same one. Whoops. It's the same one that I provided. So this is, you can download this, and I'll give you the link. I'll just click on the link, and you should be able to download it. Again, if there's any problems, please let me know. So that's what I have on my other monitor. Okay. And I'm just using that as a guideline. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go using the clay. Let's go into, let's try clay tubes. So let's B for brush menu, C clay, and T for clay tubes. Now I'm going to bring the intensity down to 15. Whoops. Let's try maybe 17 and hit enter. And I'm just going to start sculpting. I'm going to make sure I'm in symmetry, so you can see there's two dots. And let's just take a look. And looking at our reference, I can tell that I want to bring this area down a bit. So I'm just using Alt. And if you remember, the clay tubes I like to use because it's a little bit more subtle than the clay buildup, especially at these lower settings. And it allows me to refine the shape without having to use a smooth that much. So I'm just going over it. I'm still pressing Alt. You won't see a change up here, but I'm actually in Z sub when I press Alt. It doesn't show up on the menu up there. But just know that that's what's going on. And let's fix these eyes a bit. Now I spend a lot of time on eyes because this is really the most important focal point for the face. You know, if your eyes are out of whack, it really makes everything look off. That's why this guy's looking kind of off right now. Actually, let's Dynamesh, Control, Drag. That's it. Okay, so now, if you saw what happened, let's go into Shift F. Let's go into Frame, Control Z. Oops. Okay, so when I did the Dynamesh, you can see it updated. And now I have better topology to sculpt this eye area. So if you ever find that you're not getting what you want, just make sure you Dynamesh. And I'm just stroking along areas that I'm looking at different angles and just trying to match up. Just trying to match up angles like my artwork. So for instance, oops, if you look at this image, I'm looking at this angle over here of my sculpt, and then while what I'm doing is I'm trying to match it up. Now there's also a neat trick you can do. Let's see if it's going to let me do this now. If you wanted to put this image onto your desktop, like any reference image, doesn't have to be this image, but any reference image you have, and you want to place it on your desktop, there's this pretty neat feature in ZBrush 4R6, and that's this see-through mode, which I'm not sure you guys can see. Let's see here. It's up here anyway, and it says see-through transparency, and basically you can make ZBrush transparent and look at your desktop. Now I have this awesome Titanfall desktop, which I'm not going to use for reference, but if I wanted to create a desktop image and place it on my desktop and use that as reference, I could simply use this feature here, the see-through, and then adjust my sculpt accordingly and just follow along. So I could actually match up my reference image with the sculpt. I'm not going to go that far because let's go back to 0 here, because I don't need to go exact. I'm just going to go by eye. But that's one thing you could do if you wanted to. It's not a bad idea actually. So let's continue on. I'm noticing that these cheeks are protruding out a bit. He's kind of got this roundish cheeks on my model compared to the reference image. So I'm just gonna, excuse me, I'm gonna take these down a bit. I'm just using the Alt. If I wanted to, I could use the trim dynamic and Alt BTD. I'll show you what that does. But in this case, it kind of flattens things. So it really works to get the generic planes, and I do use the trim dynamic quite often. It's almost, you have to I imagine it almost like being as though you were shaving pieces of clay with a knife or a wire. Actually, a wire tool, a loop tool. It's similar to using a loop tool on clay, and you're just taking down, shaving off minute layers of clay. It's actually, I would say that's probably the closest thing you're gonna. I would consider real world similarities is that it's like a ribbon tool or a loop tool, where it carves and flattens at the same time. So this is kind of, I prefer using the trim dynamic or the Alt on the clay tubes, like I mentioned before, as opposed to smoothing, because it gives you this really great surface that's much more alive than if I were to just smooth it over. Let's go back to the clay tubes, B, C, T. So that's my my preferred method of working on sculptures is really keeping it nice and leaving some tool marks, as I like to call them. And this just comes from my traditional background, but I just find that this makes characters, especially game characters, a little bit more realistic and not so plasticky, you know. Okay, so let's go in here. Actually, let's go back to the trim dynamic. Now, if I wanted to focus on a certain area of my sculpt, I could simply go and press Control Shift and drag, and you'll notice the green selection box, and I'm just going to hold. I can let go of Control and Shift, and I'm just going to hold the spacebar and then continue dragging. So the spacebar allows me to move this around, and I'm just going to focus on the part that I want. So in this case, I'm just going to focus on the eyes. And if I wanted to select even further, I could Control Shift drag and press Alt, and then this will deselect the area. So now I'm just working with this, and it's a little bit easier to manage. Just note that you can't Dynamesh when the mesh is not fully visible. So if I Control drag, it says mesh must be fully visible in order to Dynamesh. So just keep that in mind, that if you do want to Dynamesh, you have to make the mesh visible again. And all you do is press Control Shift and click on the canvas. Okay, so, and again, you're not deleting anything when you do this, it's just you're hiding it. Okay, so another thing to keep in mind though is that if you do decide to sculpt on this area here on the border, it's only going to affect the area that's visible. So if I make everything visible again, you're going to see that it acts almost like a mask. So it didn't affect any of the area that was invisible. So that's another thing to keep in mind. So it's actually really cool If you want to isolate areas so they're not affected by your sculpting, this is really good. And you can further uh, what's pretty cool is that you can further isolate objects in a very specific manner by using polygroups. And let me show you that because it's pretty cool. So let's Control Shift click. Okay, so now if I put on polyframe, Shift F, or I press over here, you'll notice this is all one polygroup. And a really easy way to create polygroups. There's several ways to create polygroups, and they're all controlled under the polygroups menu. Or you could use there's some hotkeys, for instance, like Group Mask, Clear Mask, which is Control W. Not all of these have hotkeys, but I'm pretty sure you could create your own. But we won't get into that, because quite frankly I never use that. I'm using the interface exactly as it's shipped with ZBrush. So if you do want to customize, there are lots of videos that show you how to customize ZBrush. I never do it, and that's just my preference, but a lot of people do, and you can even have different iterations of your interface that you can use for different things. So for instance, if you want an interface that's specifically for poly painting, or one for hard surface, or one for organic, you can create different interfaces and save them, and then just switch between them up here or in your user preferences. I never do that, so I'm not going to show you that. But like I said, there's tons of tutorials on there. And quite frankly, I'm not that well versed. So, moving on, polygroups. Now, what I want to do is I want to, just for the sake of showing you, I want to isolate an area here, so I can just sculpt on maybe the lower eyelid and the upper eyelid in two different. Basically, what I want to do is separate these two items in polygroups so that I can quickly mask them off. Okay, so a good way to do that is, let's get out of polyframe. So if you remember, this is all just one polyframe. Sorry, one polygroup. Okay. Now I'm going to use the control polygroup by mask, clear mask. So what I'm going to do is press Control, and I want to make sure I'm in mask pen. And I'm just gonna, holding Control, I'm gonna paint a mask on the area that I want to polygroup. Okay. And you can be as careful as you want. Now I'm going to press Control W, and then you're gonna see the mask is cleared. Now if I go into polyframe, you will see that it has created its own polygroup. So which is great, because now if I want to isolate that, all I do is press Control, Shift, and click, and I've isolated that piece. Okay, let's go back. Now let's do the same thing on the upper eyelid. Press Control W, and now you can see, almost looks like makeup, but now you can see that I have three different polygroups: the whole mesh, and then these two little pieces here. So now, let's say I only want to sculpt on this top lid. One way I could do that is simply go in Control, Shift, and click, and then I've isolated that area. Now, keeping Control pressed, I tap on the canvas, and then Control, Shift, click again to bring it all back. Okay, and now to invert this mask, I press Control and click again, and now I've inverted the mask in just a few clicks. And if I want to sculpt, I can sculpt freely, and I'm actually not able to affect any other area. Okay, if I want to invert the mask, or if I want to click another mask, let's clear the mask first. So Control click, mask, Control click, Shift, invert the mask, Control and click. Okay, so now I'm just going to sculpt on the bottom part. And there you have it. So if you can see, it only affects the part that's unmasked. So that's kind of a neat trick. I sometimes do that. I sometimes don't do that. And let's just see, Control drag and re-Dynamesh. Now, when you re-Dynamesh, those polygroups will get lost. Okay, so let's just undo that. Now, if you want to keep those, let's see here. Now, if I take off polypaint, it's gonna maintain my polygroups. Okay, and the reason is because Dynamesh now will remember if you had any polypainting on this on your mesh and you want to keep it. Dynamesh will now remember it, but it will forget your polygroups. So if you want to keep your polygroups while you're Dynameshing, you have to take off the polypaint. Now there is a groups button here, and this will also remember your polygroups. But if I recall, if you press on groups and now I Dynamesh, oops, hold on. Let's go back to here. Let's go back to where we were. Okay, so this is back on. Now I'm going to press groups and let's see what happens. Okay, so this is the reason why, create a big mess. This is the reason why I didn't use the groups button, is because what happens is Dynamesh will actually separate them. So if I wanted to, press W. Now, whoops. So now I can actually separate the mesh. Okay, which is not what I want. Okay. And we're back where we were before. Okay, so let's try Dynameshing again. So see, it didn't separate. It also didn't keep my polygroups because I left the poly paint button on. But that's one thing to keep in mind. The Dynamesh groups is very handy if you want to separate an object or create cuts in hard surface modeling, for instance, or things like that. But in this case, I don't want to actually separate the mesh. I just wanted to keep the polygroups. Okay, so anyway, that was one trick that you can use for masking out things. I don't use that very often, just because usually when I have, let's see, brush, auto masking, back face mask on, I usually can get away with going pretty close and not having to worry about masking or anything like that. But if I do want to mask, I usually just quickly paint. So I don't usually bother doing all that, but it depends. I mean, at this point, this model is pretty simple. When you have more complex models, using the polygroups to mask is really good, because when you start getting into things like hard surface sculpting, and when you have a lot of pieces and things like that that aren't separated, maybe on one subtool, it's nice to have that option to just mask with a polygroup. But that's something we'll get into a little later on, I think. Okay, so let's get back to the sculpting part, and let's see. I'm just going over here and looking at my reference image and just trying to take down areas. Now, there's some weird stuff going on here, so I'm just going to use the trim dynamic, BTD, trim dynamic, and let's fix this skull shape a bit. See, it shouldn't have all these kind of ridges up here. And I'm not talking about this banding or these lines. I'm talking like these weird protrusions. That are happening. It's not quite a good skull shape. It's kind of square as well. I kind of want a little bit more volume pointing outwards. So maybe I'll even use something like, let's try like the inflate, B-I-N for inflate. Maybe inflate that out a little bit, maybe with a larger draw size. Let's kind of make it look like, you know, things are pushing out. Remember how I was saying in the last lesson, you always want to make it look. Some of these brushes can flatten a surface, which is fine. But you kind of want to bring some of that. You want to kind of bring some of that out. You know, if you look at pictures of organic things, it's almost like they have internal forces that are pushing outwards. So you kind of want to, whenever you find that there's really flat surfaces, you kind of want to add a little bit of a bulge or an inflation. Just, it's very subtle. I'm not talking like, you know, big inflations or anything like that. But I think you understand what I mean in that you don't want to have these flat surfaces on something that's organic. You kind of want to look like they have a soul or like forces are pushing outwards. And I think this adds a little bit of realism. You can also try using the alt version of the inflate, so the sub-inflate, and it actually will deflate it a little bit. So you don't have to switch brushes. You can actually just use the alt function and just see what it does. It kind of depresses it a little bit. So it's kind of neat to... The cool thing about inflate as well is if you want to bring two areas together, you can inflate, like the lips are a good example. Kind of pushes it. That's probably a little too much. It kind of looks like he's got a, you know, that selfie duck face, but let's go back to that. We don't want that. Okay. Just using the inflate still. Just bringing out some forms, just adding some subtlety. So he's starting to shape up, but I still find that the eyes are a little off, and I find that this brow arch is not quite conforming to what I have on my as my reference image. So also the eyes seem to be a little bit too squinty. So I'm gonna go and I'm gonna use a different move tool now. It's called Move Topological, and I've talked about it before. It's basically, it's only going to affect areas, for the most part anyway, that have different topology. So usually if you want to affect this area up here, it won't affect this area up here because this area has different topology than this area. So sometimes it still affects it a bit, but for the most part it works quite well. So that way I don't have to mask the bottom eyelid. So I press B, M for move, and T for topological. And I'm going to use a little bit of a larger draw size. And I'm just going to go up. So if you can see that it's not really affecting the bottom lid at all, and I can easily manipulate the top. Now one thing to know is that this brush doesn't work very well at high resolutions, so you should really keep this use this brush at lower resolutions. And actually you can tell it's a little slower to use than the regular move brush because it has to calculate the topology of the surface. So that's why it's kind of has a slight lag to it. But we're still okay. It's not really... See, it is affecting a little bit up top, so if I lower my draw size a little. But just kind of moving things around. Just trying to give him a little bit of a better eye shape. Now his eyelids are a little bit undefined and a little puffy, so that's why it's kind of not looking quite that great. Might bring these in a little bit, these tear duct areas. And maybe let's bring this up. So there's a lot of playing around that you have to do when you're modeling a face. The face is very, very subtle, and you know, sometimes you look at your face and the face you're modeling, you're like, You know, I just don't understand what's wrong with it. So sometimes it's a matter of, you know, looking around and trying to figure out what's wrong, and then from there make adjustments and try things out. That's what's great about ZBrush, is that, you know, I can actually make adjustments and say, well, no, that doesn't look good, or that looks better, or you know, and it just allows me to try different things and see what's not working, what's working. So sometimes, you know, you'll come back to a sculpt after you haven't looked at it for a while, and you notice there's a lot of things wrong, and you know, using something like the move brush, let's go back to the move brush actually, BMV, really lets you manipulate areas and change things. So, you know, maybe I don't like, maybe this was, oh, that's terrible. Control Z. Maybe I don't like the shape of the lips, or how they're positioned, and I can just bring them up. You know, big moves like this you want to do at lower resolution. That's why we're trying to. That's why we're not really going into details right now. We're still working on the secondary forms. But for instance, I can move these nostrils down. To me, it looks a little bit better already. And I'm just going to push this area in a bit. Maybe move the cheeks up. And already, I'm finding that it looks better. I think the temples might be able to go in a bit. So one thing to keep in mind though, when you do make moves like this with the move tool, it does tend to flatten out areas a bit. Maybe that's too much, but I kind of like it. So you want to look from different angles. It seems to me like this brow might be protruding a bit. So let's just go up, different angle, and let's just look at how the planes line up. You know, one thing about sculpting faces, or sculpting anything, it does require a lot of study. So don't expect to learn, you know, in a day or in a week. It's a constant study. I'm always learning new things, and you know, I've been doing this for a while, and I still, you know, I'm still always learning, you know, trying new things and figuring out how things line up, and you know, the proportions. It's a lot to remember, and the face is extremely complex. That's why if you can sculpt a portrait, you can pretty much sculpt anything, I think, because you know, the face has all these different areas and angles, and you know, in order to make it look right, there's a lot of work involved and a lot of knowledge. So this area here is looking kind of off. So let's go into Clay Tubes, BCT, and I still have that low intensity setting, and I'm just gonna try to fix this area. I think this is protruding a little bit, so let's go in Alt, and let's go up. I'm gonna try to mimic the eyebrows a bit, and I find sometimes that doing this, now I'm actually not trying to mimic the individual hairs, but more the look. I find that when I put in eyebrows, it actually helps quite a bit to get to fix the shape. There's something going on here. Let's see. Just gonna keep tweaking. Excuse me. So that's not really working. Obviously, this needs to be moved up a little bit, so I'm just using the Alt, and let me smooth that a little. So if you saw there, it started to kind of crease a bit, and that makes it kind of hard to sculpt on when you're doing when you're using sub. If I was to sculpt with the additive, it's no problem, but when I'm trying to bring this down a bit, it can be a little tricky when it starts to crease like that. So all I do is iron it out. So I'll press Shift and just use the smooth to iron that, and that kind of irons out the polygons a bit, and it's a little bit easier if I use the Alt to make those go back or subtract, push inward, you know. So that's kind of a little trick. Let's isolate this area. So we have Alt. There we go. We don't have to worry about the other stuff. Now you don't want to get stuck on doing just one area. because then if you start, if you try to sculpt the eye perfectly and you're just focused on this little area here, when you bring the model back fully visible, you're going to notice that it's going to most likely look off. So you just want to, I'm just isolating this right now, because I just want to work on the eyelids. But once I have the eyelids established, I'm going to go back and view the full model. Otherwise, my proportions, I want to refine the sculpture all around at the same level before I move to the next level. So, for instance, before I even move to tertiary or detail, or doing details on this model, I want to make sure that all my secondary forms all around the model have been established and have been set in place. Because really, when you talk about details are kind of the icing on the cake, as I mentioned before. But if the understructure doesn't look good, no matter how much you detail, it's never going to look right. And the most important thing actually is to have a solid base to have details put on afterwards. So you can't, there's no shortcuts. Details are fun, and that's why a lot of people try to, I think, jump to that. But it is kind of the third step, and you really have to follow the whole process. Now, what I'm noticing is that I don't really have a really defined eyelid established, so I should probably do that. Let's try with the standard BST for standard brush, and I usually like to use this alpha here, alpha 1. And let's try to bring this out. Let's maybe iron it out a little bit. Shift, iron it out. Now it looks like I probably don't have a lot of resolution. Let's maybe use the move tool, BMV. Let's move that a little bit. Let's mask this area a bit. So just Control and Mask Pen, and maybe something like that. I don't know, that doesn't really look right, but let's see from farther away. I think maybe the position of his eyes might be a little off. Well, maybe not. Let's see. Let's clear the mask, and actually now what I want to do is let's go and make the whole make the whole model visible. So see how that changed? When you're only looking at one little part, it's really hard to tell if any of the changes you made look that good until you bring the whole model in. And so if you look, I'm really noticing that it looks like these eyeballs might be spaced too far apart. Even though I had measured them, I've obviously made some changes to the overall face that makes the eyes a little too far apart. I probably brought the mouth in a bit, brought the temples in a bit. So what I'm going to do is press N, bring up my subtool menu and click here. And now I should be in my eyeball subtool, which I am. Now I'm going to press W, and I'm going to drag out the line, and press Shift to snap it. And I'm going to press, let's go a little bit closer, and I'm going to use the center circle with the Shift press. That way it snaps to this line. So if I don't use the Shift, I can move it all around. But if I press Shift, it's attached to that line that I dragged out. So if I wanted to go up and press Shift and maintain that path, I just use that. Okay. So Shift, let's see here. So it's going to be subtle, and it's probably easier to see it farther away. So I'm going to bring this down a bit. Even though I brought this down, it's still going to affect this plane, especially if I press Shift. So usually your pupil should be lined up to the corner of your mouth. And maybe a little bit more. So if I press up here. So this side of the pupil should be lined up with the corner of your mouth, and that looks pretty good. Maybe the eye needs to go up a bit though. Let's see. Not sure. I think maybe my whole eye shape is too slanted. And let's press Alt and click on the main subtool, which is the head. And now it's switched. Or you could have simply used the N again, or click in the subtool menu. So I'm using the move tool, and I want to affect. I'm finding that this area here is not quite working for me, and I think maybe that's what's causing this to look funny. So I'm going to use the move tool, and I'm just going to make some adjustments and see what works. Well, it looks a little bit better already. There, I think that's pretty good. And so you can see it's really subtle stuff. I mean, I didn't make very much. Let's just move the jaw in a bit here. I didn't really make big changes. Let's just save that, pressing 9. But I find that already looks a little bit better. There is some funkiness over here with the brow. Okay, with the brow. Let's just look at my reference image here. So from the side view, let's see. Now I could bring in my image planes like I did before, but because I've been doing this by eye, it's probably not going to match up. And if I try to match it up, it's probably going to make more of a mess than if I try to just do it by eye. So what I'm going to do is just going to go off screen here. And I'm going to look at my side view. It doesn't really matter which side view you look at, because the sides are, the profile is symmetrical. The sides are not symmetrical, but the profile is symmetrical. But I'm going to look at this, and I'm going to try to follow what I did here previously. Let's just go back onto the other monitor over here. So I have that on my other monitor, and I can already tell that this cheek seems to be forward too much, and maybe this mouth, the corner of the mouth as well. So I'm just going to use my move tool and bring it back. Maybe bring this back a little bit. And already that's starting to look better. Some weirdness with the jaw here. Let's maybe bring this back a little bit. Usually like to line up the jaw roughly where the mouth is. Maybe bring this in a bit. So I don't want to make too many adjustments, because I want to, let's just bring the nose. He's got a little bit of a pointier nose. I'm not trying to copy exactly, but let's try to maybe make it close. So all I'm doing is looking at my reference images on my other monitor, and I think he needs a bit more of a divot over here. And this brow, not brow, needs to come up. Okay, so this is what it's like. You're just, there's no magic formula to this. It's just kind of looking at your reference and just try to match it up. And it'll probably take a while. I mean, the more you do this, obviously, the faster you're going to become, and the more you're going to, really understand forms. I'm just playing with the ear a little bit. Let's use the pinch brush, and B, P, and I for pinch. See the pinch brush here, and what the pinch brush does is actually brings, well, it pinches things. So a way to illustrate this, actually, if you look at this area here, if I want to bring these two areas together, I'll just go in the middle, and you can see what it does. Kind of pinches that form, or if I want to make that more subtle, it'll actually, slim it down a bit. Now this is something that you want to do with Dynamesh, or use it sparingly if you're in subdivision levels, because pinching let's go into polyframe. Kind of screws up the topology quite a bit, and if you wanted to resculpt on that, it would be kind of difficult. So Dynamesh, it doesn't matter because it's just going to re-update the topology every time you re-Dynamesh. So that's just something to keep in mind when you use the pinch brush. Make sure it's not on like your final model, or if you do, just do it sparingly because it can make it difficult to make other changes afterwards. It'll basically make pinched geometry. I just want to make these forms a little more subtle. And let's Dynamesh. There you go. Let's just save that quickly. Now here I want to carve in a bit, so let's use the clay buildup BCB. And let's just make sure that backface mask is on. So I go to brush, auto masking, backface mask. And this way I'm sure I'm not going to go through any thin areas and collapse the mesh. So I'm just going to go in here. I usually turn backface mask on all the time. For this kind of brush anyway. And let's just cross hatch. Just using the Alt. And let's kind of carve in some forms here because this looks like one continuous form, which it's not really. So these muscles attach to the base of the skull, which is here roughly, so I want to make sure. Just cross-hatching. I want to make sure I kind of make that, and I don't want it to just be one flat plane. And because these muscles have a cylindrical shape, I'm actually going over the surface trying to mimic that shape, and you can go down as well, but I find that changing it, changing the direction of your stroke makes it look a little bit more organic than if you're just going down. If you're just doing this the whole time, it's not going to look that cylindrical. Actually, let's undo that. Yeah. Okay, so let me keep on carving in because your ears are not attached like that. And let's go in, go in, go in, and look at your reference and just try to see how you can mimic the shapes in the photograph. So you should have multiple reference images from different angles. It doesn't have to be the same person. It does help if it is the same person, but it doesn't have to be. But in addition to even the reference images I gave you, because the more reference you have, the better sometimes. Okay, so that's looking a little bit better actually. I'm not sure about this area here. This probably could use a bit of separation. Still using the clay buildup. The Alt. You could use the clay tubes as well if you wanted to. Now this is looking a little flat. Let's just kind of bring that up a bit. And it's like putting in forms, taking them down, putting in forms, taking them down. That's what it's like. The more you do this, the faster you become at it too. I mean, there's people that are way faster at this than I am, so, I'm a little bit slow, I think. But I do this for fun, so I don't really care. Let's move that in BMV. I don't like how this is shaping, so let's maybe just... Now I find that when I sculpt on something for more than 3 hours, I tend to lose sight of what's happening. So usually it's good to take a break every so often and just come in with fresh eyes. And after 3 hours, I find that I get really tired and it's difficult to see the shape. So I'll move on to something else maybe. If you were working on a full figure, you could always maybe go to another part of the model, or maybe he has some weapons or props you want to make. You could move on. Oops. Let's go into clay buildup. You could move on to doing that instead, or if you have a deadline or something, and then maybe come back and look at it again. I find that sometimes I'll be sculpting away, and I find that I think my piece looks awesome, and I come back the next day and I look at it again, and it's like, what the heck? It looks terrible, So that's just kind of what happens, part of the process. Let's go into Move Tool, BMV, and so that's just something to keep in mind. You will get tired, and your brain kind of remembers. Let's go into Pinch. Your brain kind of remembers shapes, it seems. And so you might not be able to see what's going on with your figure. Okay, let's just do a quick save here. Press 9. Okay, I think I'm going to stop here. We moved along quite a bit. You might not notice. You might not notice that much improvement over the first. Over what we first did. Let's actually go back down. Let's keep on going. So I just used a scrub bar here. This is what we started with from the last lesson, and let's just go back up. I'm on the last one, and that's what we ended up with. So even though it's subtle, you can definitely see that there's an improvement. Okay, so hopefully this has helped you continue on with your own work, and just remember, you have to be patient, and it does take time, it does take a lot of effort, and it does take a lot of study, and it will get frustrating, but if you work through it, you will get really good at sculpting faces, or sculpting in general. So having said that, I'm going to stop this video here, and again, if you like this video and enjoyed the information, please like my video, and I will see you in the next one.